Okay, this lecture is on evolution by natural selection, Darwin's theory of how organisms change over time. So we start with the age of the Earth. We think the Earth has been around about 4.6 billion years. And if we look at the Earth's time here in this spiral, there was a long period of time before there was any living things on Earth. And now it was followed by a long period of time where there were just unicellular organisms. And then more recently, there's an explosion of multicellular living things. And in the last 200,000 years is when humans have actually inhabited the Earth. So it really hasn't been that long if you compare it to the entire time the Earth has been around. Darwin described evolution as this process of descent with modification. And so here we have organisms that you're probably familiar with, the Asian elephant and the African elephant. And we know that these guys have a extinct cousin, the woolly mammoth. So if we go back in time, we can find the common ancestor that gave rise to all three of these. And we can go back even further in time to find the common ancestor that gave rise to all of these organisms that related to the elephant. And what we see is that as they leave descendants, over time, we're seeing these modifications or changes within these organisms. So you're going to see the development of a trunk, and you see the development of tusks that are lacking in these earlier organisms. So this is this descent with modification. And so this is how Darwin saw evolution as happening. Darwin also described overproduction, that organisms produce way more offspring than could possibly survive in the next generation. There was another Englishman who wrote about this, Malthus. And so we have a picture here of a frog. Malthus focused mostly on humans, but Darwin was looking at this for all organisms. And so here this frog is producing many, many, many more eggs than could possibly survive in the next generation. If all of those eggs hatched and developed into frogs, we would be overrun with frogs. And then all of those offspring have variation within the populations, and so we have a couple of examples here. Here's some beetles with different colored carapaces. We have these different whelks with different colors of their shells, and then of course we're more familiar with the variation that we see within the human population. And then this leads us to the struggle for existence. So organisms, there's many more than can survive, and so they're struggling for the resources that are available to them. They're struggling for food resources, for shelter, for mates, for avoiding predation, and so on. And then that leads to differential reproductive success. So some variants are going to be more successful in that struggle for existence, and therefore survive and then reproduce and leave the genes for that particular variation in their offspring. So here's an example of that, and we have these insects, and these insects have some variation with them. So we have these guys with this green gene, which are susceptible to a particular insecticide, and then we have this red variant, which is resistant to the insecticide. So if these particular insects feed on these particular crops and the farmers spray their crops with an insecticide, that insecticide would kill all the green ones, so now all our green ones are croaked here, but our red one survives because it has a gene that makes it resistant to that particular insecticide. And that particular survivor then leaves offspring, and their offspring leave offspring, and so on. So now we have a population of bugs that now have this resistant gene. We can see the same thing with bacteria. So we have a plate of bacteria, and there's different variants within this dish. And then some are resistant to a particular antibiotic, some are susceptible to it. We treat them with this antibiotic, and we are selecting for those individuals that are resistant. And then in the next generation, we have a population of resistant bacteria. So this is just showing how certain organisms are going to be the ones that survive and reproduce. And this is based on adaptation. So an adaptation is something that's going to give the organism fitness, or give the organism the ability to survive and reproduce and leave offspring that then in turn are able to leave offspring. So we have a hummingbird here, which is adapted to this particular flower. The flower in turn is adapted to the hummingbird. Okay, so an overview of the theory of natural selection. So Darwin described that organisms leave way more offspring than can possibly survive in the next generation, that there's variation within those organisms. There's a struggle for existence, and those individuals with the variation that allows them to be successful in that struggle are going to leave many more offspring than others. So there's a differential reproductive success. Some are more successful than others. So that is natural select organisms. Okay, there's lots of evidence that this has happened, and we're going to look at a bunch of those. We'll start with evidence in the fossil record. So here we have some fossils, and so these all here are actual pictures of fossils that have been found. There's many more than they're showing even here. This is a little cartoon sketch indicating what you're seeing in that fossil. So here we have some kind of a fin or a lobe or whatever, and I'm not really sure what this one's showing us, but here we're starting to see digits, and here we're seeing lots and lots of digits, and now we're starting to see a reduction in those digits, and now we're down to like a hand with 5 digits. So here we're just seeing change over time in these organisms in the fossil record. And we have lots of fossils to indicate change of different body parts over time. Another example that we use as evidence for evolution is in biogeography. We can look at the movement of the continents on Earth. The Earth has evolved, and compare that to where we find certain organisms, and we find patterns. So as an example, we know that the continents were all clustered together in Pangaea at one point, and now there's been separating into what we see as today. So down below is showing you the Earth kind of as it is today. The organisms over here on the left, these are placentals, and placentals have a placenta. So the placenta helps to nourish the developing fetus in the uterus, bring it oxygen and nutrients, and get rid of wastes. Marsupials are a group of organisms that lack a placenta, and so these organisms have the babies are born at a very immature stage, and they crawl out into a pouch and nurse in a pouch and develop the rest of the way. Well, we only see marsupials, or we see most of the marsupials, in Australia. And we know that Australia at one point was connected to Antarctica. And we also find fossil evidence of these organisms in Antarctica, South America, and in North America we find only one marsupial, and that's the possum. So we can look at a lot of different organisms and look at these patterns of movement of the continents and look at where we find these particular organisms, and these kind of match up to kind of supports these organisms changing over time and adapting to these different environments. Another example is what we call homologies. And so homologous structures are structures that they probably were retained from a common ancestor, but now have a different function. So here we have these colored patterns to indicate the different bones, and so you can see the same color patterns or the same bones with these different organisms. So the penguin has a flipper, the alligator has a claw, the bat has a wing, the human has an arm. So functionally, these are different. However, structurally, they are the same, which indicate they probably descended from a common ancestor that had these same bones. And we can see the same thing in plants. So here we have a leaf, and this leaf has been modified for different functions. So here we have a pitcher plant, which collects water and traps insects, the Venus flytrap, which actually catches its prey, insects, the poinsettia, where the flower is actually yellow, but some of the leaves are modified to look like petals to attract a pollinator, and then the cactus, which has spines, so the leaves are modified as spines to avoid predation. Another piece of evidence that we use is embryological evidence, and so we can look at the embryological development of different organisms. So this picture is just showing 3 stages in the embryological development, stage 1, 2, 3 here. And this is a lizard, I don't know if you can read this, a tortoise, a pig, and a human. So we can look at the embryological development of these different organisms, and organisms that are more closely related resemble each other more closely in their embryological development. So if you were to compare a human to a pig, they look much more similar than if you compare the human to the lizard. And that just indicates that we probably have a common ancestor in more recent time to the pig than we do to the lizard. And here's just a little joke. The amoebas talking to each other. We know they don't talk to each other. Okay, another piece of evidence that we use is vestigial structures. So there are structures that organisms have but do not use. So a good example of that is a blind cavefish. So these are fish that live in complete darkness, and they do not have sight. However, they have eyes, which indicates that they probably descended from an organism that had sight and had functional eyes. And that would be a vestigial structure because they have the eye, but it's not functional. Here's another vestigial structure, which is the leg bud. So the snake no longer has legs, doesn't use legs, but it has some of the bones of a leg, which indicates that it probably came from an ancestor that had legs, which indicates change over time. And then the last bit of evidence that we use to show change over time is looking at the actual molecules. So molecules evolve as well. Molecules are changing over time. So we can look at things like nucleotides of DNA or RNA or the amino acid sequences in proteins. And so here we're looking at hemoglobin, which is the protein found in red blood cells that finds oxygen. And so if we look at any red-blooded organism, we can look at the amino acid sequence of the molecule. So in this case, we're comparing a human to all these different organisms. So if we look at a human and compare it to a lamprey, which is a jawless fish, we find that there are 125 differences in the amino acid sequence of the hemoglobin molecule. If we compare the human to the macaque, which is a primate, there are 8 differences. So the fact that there are only 8 differences indicates that we share a common ancestor in more recent time. The lamprey, way far, a long time ago, we would have shared a common ancestor because we have so many differences. So there was a lot of time for these differences to accumulate. And we can kind of develop what's called a molecular clock by doing this. So more differences indicate a time greater in our history, and less differences a more recent ancestor. So that is the evidence for evolution. There's a difference between divergence and convergence. So divergence is where organisms share a common ancestor and at some point they diverged. And convergence is where organisms don't share a common ancestor, but they're adapting to a similar environment, so they're kind of converging or starting to look similar. So divergence are going to look different, but they may have the same structures. Convergence, they may look similar, but they're going to have different structures. And so a good example of that are looking at these winged species. So all 3 of these organisms are adapted for flight. They all have wings. But if we look at the wing of a bat and compare that to the wing of a bird, we find the same bone structure. So even though the bat is using its phalanges here, these long, right, that are webbed to fly, and the bird is not structurally like that, there are still the same bones, but they have adapted to flight. Now, if we compare the insect to that, the insect lacks bones altogether. So even though the insect has a wing and it's adapted for flight, this indicates to us that it does not have a common ancestor with these other organisms, that this would be an example of convergence in evolution. And this is just showing you the evolution of Mickey Mouse over time. And the last little slide down, picture down here is one last point I want to make, and that's that we can't decide we want to evolve. We can't choose what kinds of things we want to evolve. Evolution doesn't work that way. So natural selection is only going to work on random variations, random mutations that occur in organisms that become adaptive, that help that organism survive, reproduce, and leave offspring that are in turn going to reproduce. And that's the end of natural selection.